Somewhere in the forests of northern Michigan, beneath nearly a foot of soil and decades of fallen leaves, there are graves with no names on them, no headstones, no markers of any kind. The men buried there died in logging camps during the late 1800s, and the companies that employed them made sure the public never heard about it. Not because they lacked the resources to give these men a proper burial. They had the resources. They simply didn't see the point. This was logging in America during its golden era, a period stretching roughly from the 1850s through the 1930s, when the timber industry was one of the most powerful economic forces this country had ever seen. Lumber barons controlled entire regions. They built towns from scratch, owned the stores, the churches, the post offices, and the saloons. They hired men by the thousands and worked them until their bodies gave out. And when those men died, as they did with alarming regularity, the companies found quiet, efficient ways to make the paperwork disappear. The official history of American logging is a story of rugged individualism and frontier triumph. What that history tends to leave out are the labor camps that more closely resembled prisons than workplaces, the death tolls that rivaled active combat zones, the convict laborers essentially sold into the industry by southern state governments, and the government officials who looked the other way because the money was too good to disturb. This is the story that didn't make it into the history books. If you find this kind of buried American history as compelling as we do, subscribing to this channel takes about 3 seconds, and make sure you never miss another story like this one. To understand what went wrong inside America's logging camps, you first need to understand the forces that created them. These weren't isolated pockets of abuse that developed by accident. They were the predictable result of an industry operating with almost no outside regulation, enormous profit potential, and a labor pool made up of men who had very few other options. The post-Civil War period saw an explosion of industrial demand for lumber. Cities were being built at a pace that had never been seen before. Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, and dozens of smaller Midwest cities were expanding so rapidly that the construction industry could barely keep up. Michigan alone produced more board feet of lumber between 1860 and 1900 than any other state in the country. Its white pine forests were so vast that early surveyors described them as effectively inexhaustible. That assessment turned out to be catastrophically wrong, but in the moment, it created the perfect conditions for unbridled industrial extraction. If the resource seemed unlimited, there was no reason to be careful with it. And if there was no reason to be careful with the timber, there was certainly no reason to be careful with the men harvesting it. The men who came to work in these camps arrived from every corner of the continent and from across the Atlantic. Scandinavian immigrants flooded into the Great Lakes camps, particularly Finns and Swedes, drawn by recruiters who met ships in East Coast ports and promised steady wages and good conditions. Canadians came south. Irish and German immigrants came west. What all of these men shared was a desperate need for work and very little knowledge of what they were walking into. Recruitment brokers, called man-catchers in the industry slang of the time, were paid a commission for every man they delivered to a camp. Their job was to fill the roster, not to tell the truth about working conditions. So they didn't. When a man arrived at a logging camp for the first time, usually after a long journey by rail into some of the most remote territory in the country, he found himself in a world that operated by its own rules. The camp foreman had near total authority. There were no labor laws to speak of. There were no safety inspectors. There was no mechanism for a worker to file a complaint with any outside authority. And even if such a mechanism had existed, the nearest town was often a full day's travel away through wilderness that the company knew well, and the workers did not. The bunkhouses were long, low structures, built to hold as many men as possible. 40 to 60 men sleeping in a single room was common. Ventilation was minimal. The men slept on bunks filled with hay or pine boughs that were rarely replaced, and the combination of unwashed bodies, wet wool clothing drying near the central stove, and the accumulated grime of a week's hard work created conditions that were essentially a perfect incubator for infectious disease. Lice were so universal that they were accepted as part of life. Typhoid outbreaks were common enough that experienced loggers knew to be suspicious of the water supply at every new camp. Tuberculosis was endemic to the industry for decades, though companies were reluctant to acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have required them to improve the bunkhouses. What the companies had most carefully engineered was the financial relationship between themselves and the worker. The company store was the centerpiece of this system. In most logging camps, workers were paid not in US currency, but in company scrip, vouchers that could only be spent at the company-owned store, where prices were, without exception, higher than the outside market. Boots that might cost $1.50 in town cost $2.75 at the company store. Tobacco, blankets, extra socks, all of them priced at a premium that ensured a significant portion of every man's wages flowed directly back to the company. In the most remote operations, there was literally no alternative to the company's store because there was no other store within reasonable reach. Men who arrived at a camp in debt for their transportation costs found that their first month's wages barely covered the interest. The scrip system ensured it would take considerably longer before they had accumulated enough real money to leave, if they ever did. The Potlatch Lumber Company in northern Idaho carried this model to its logical extreme. The town of Potlatch, which the company built from nothing in 1905, was entirely owned by the company. The housing, the stores, the schools, the churches, all of it was company property. Workers rented company houses, bought from company stores, and sent their children to schools the company funded. For a man living and working in Potlatch in 1910, the lumber company was not just his employer. It was, in nearly every meaningful sense, his government. This level of control made suppressing news of injuries and deaths almost effortless. There was no independent press to investigate. Workers who spoke too loudly about dangerous conditions found their housing lease suddenly not renewed, which in a company town meant immediate eviction and job termination at the same time. The industry labeled this a labor management strategy. Workers referred to it by other names. The deaths began almost immediate wherever major logging operations set up camp, and they never really stopped. Start with the trees themselves. Felling a tree with hand tools requires a precise understanding of how a particular tree will fall. Experienced fallers developed an intuition for this over years. Inexperienced men, of whom there were always plenty, sometimes misjudged. When they did, the consequences were immediate and almost always fatal. Even experienced fallers died because the forest created hazards no amount of skill could fully eliminate. The most feared was the widowmaker, dead branches caught high in the canopy that a falling tree would send spinning toward the ground. A widowmaker from 60 feet could arrive with enough force to drive a man's skull into his shoulders. Experienced loggers learned to watch for them. They didn't always see them in time. Then there were the skidding operations. After a tree was felled and cut into manageable sections, the logs had to be moved from where they fell to a collection point where they could be loaded onto sleds, wagons, or rail cars. This was typically done using oxen or horses, pulling the logs along skid roads, trails greased with animal fat to reduce friction. The work of guiding these animals through dense forest, keeping chains and cables properly tensioned, and preventing massive logs from rolling off the trail required constant attention. Men who were struck by a shifting log or dragged by a panicking team of horses rarely survived long enough to reach a doctor, assuming there was a doctor within reasonable travel distance, which there frequently wasn't. The log drives were, by common consensus, the most dangerous period in the entire logging cycle. When winter ended and the rivers thawed, logs stockpiled on frozen riverbanks were sent downstream in enormous quantities, often hundreds of thousands of logs moving together in what amounted to a controlled flood. The men who worked these drives, called river pigs in the vernacular of the Great Lakes, rode the logs with spiked boots, using long poles called peaveys to break up jams and keep the flow moving. Breaking a jam was extraordinarily dangerous. The men had to identify the key log whose removal would release the built-up pressure and pull or lever it free while standing on an unstable mass of wet timber with thousands of pounds of force behind it. When the jam broke, it broke fast. A man in the wrong position was ground to pieces or drowned in the churning water. The spring death toll from log drives was taken as a cost of doing business. What makes the death toll of this era genuinely staggering is not just the number of fatalities. It's the systematic effort made by logging companies to ensure those fatalities never became part of any official record. The company doctor occupied a deeply compromised position. He was employed by the company, paid by the company, and his continued employment depended on his relationship with the company. When a worker was injured, his role was to document the cause in terms that minimized the company's liability. A man crushed when a log rolled had, according to the company doctor's report, suffered injuries as a result of his own inattention. A man who lost fingers to a saw had failed to observe basic safety precautions. When men died, the paperwork was handled with particular care. Camps maintained their own internal records, which were not subject to any outside inspection. A man who died in a remote camp might be buried in the woods before anyone outside was notified. His family might receive a brief letter months later offering condolences, but no details. If the company thought there was any chance of legal action, they might offer a small settlement in exchange for the family's agreement not to pursue the matter further. The situation was considerably worse in the South, where the timber industry's relationship with the labor supply crossed from exploitation into something that can only honestly be described as enslavement. After the Civil War, Southern states developed a legal system of convict leasing that put black men back into forced labor. Vagrancy laws in states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi made it a criminal offense to be unemployed, which effectively meant any black man not working for a white employer could be arrested at any time. Once convicted, which happened quickly and without anything resembling a fair trial, a man could be leased to a private company that paid the state a fee for his labor. The turpentine and timber industries of the Deep South were among the largest users of this system. The men doing this work lived in camps under the supervision of armed guards who were paid to keep them working and prevent escape. They received no wages. They received minimal food and shelter. They had no legal recourse and no avenue for complaint. Deaths in convict lease camps were documented even more poorly than deaths in the Great Lakes or Pacific Northwest camps, because the victims were largely black men in a legal system that did not recognize them as deserving of serious consideration. State records show that the mortality rate among convict laborers in some southern timber operations exceeded 25% annually. That means 1 in 4 men who entered those camps died there in a given year. The actual number is likely higher because the incentive to accurately report deaths was essentially zero. When investigative journalists began writing about convict leasing in the early 1900s, they faced immediate pressure from the industries that depended on it. Newspapers that ran exposés found their advertisers withdrawing. Politicians who raised the issue found their campaign funding threatened. The system had too many beneficiaries for any single voice to dislodge it. It took decades of sustained advocacy, and ultimately the economic disruption of the Great Depression before convict leasing in the South was formally abolished in Georgia in 1937. We're just getting to the part where workers started fighting back, and what happened to them when they did. Hit the like button now. It genuinely helps this kind of in-depth historical content reach more people who care about it. By the first decade of the 20th century, conditions in American logging camps had produced exactly what you would expect: a labor movement that was angrier, more radical, and more willing to confront the industry head-on than almost any other labor organization in the country. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWWW, or the Wobblies, was founded in Chicago in 1905. Unlike mainstream labor organizations, the IWWW sought to build one enormous union encompassing every worker in every industry. The timber workers of the Pacific Northwest became some of its most committed members because the conditions in Pacific Northwest camps gave them very good reasons to be. The Pacific Northwest had replaced the Great Lakes as the center of the American timber industry by early 1900. The forests of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California contained Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, and western red cedar on a scale that dwarfed even the vast stands of Michigan white pine. The camps were, if anything, more isolated and more thoroughly controlled than their Great Lakes counterparts had been. The IWWW organizers who moved through these camps faced extraordinary personal risk. Company foremen had standing authority to fire any man suspected of union organizing. And in a region where employment, housing, and access to food all ran through the company, being fired means being effectively stranded. Physical violence against organizers was common and rarely resulted in legal consequences. Despite this, the IWWW built genuine organizing networks across the Pacific Northwest, and the industry's response produced some of the most violent episodes in American labor history. In November of 1916, a group of IWW members boarded a ferry in Seattle bound for Everett, Washington, planning to hold a street rally in support of the union's free speech campaign. When the ferry docked, they were met by the county sheriff and a large number of deputies, many of whom were company men. When the shooting stopped, at least 5 IWWW men were dead on the pier. Another 2 had drowned fleeing into Puget Sound, and dozens more were wounded. None of the deputies faced any criminal charges. The IWW survivors were arrested for the deaths of 2 deputies killed in the crossfire. The sheriff who organized the confrontation was not an independent official acting on behalf of the public. He was, in the practical sense, an employee of the lumber companies, just one whose salary happened to come from the county rather than the company directly. 3 years later, the Centralia Massacre in Washington State produced another episode of extraordinary violence. On Armistice Day, American Legion members attempted to raid the local IWW hall. Wobblies inside fired on the crowd. 4 Legion members were killed. One IWW member, a veteran named Wesley Everest, was captured, lynched, and shot multiple times while hanging. His killers were never identified. The coroner's report listed his cause of death as suicide. That coroner's report captures something essential about how violence against labor organizers was managed institutional. It was not enough to commit the violence. It had to be documented in a way that absolved the perpetrators and, if possible, placed blame on the victims. The same instinct that led a company doctor in Michigan to write personal inattention on an injury report led a coroner in Washington to write suicide on a murder report. The mechanism was the same. The goal was the same, and the institutional complicity ran deep enough that no one was ever held accountable. The federal government's complicity was more structural than simply corrupt. The government had made a fundamental decision to prioritize rapid development of natural resources over almost every other consideration. The Timber and Stone Act of 1878 was almost immediately exploited by lumber companies, which hired men to file fraudulent homestead claims on forested federal land and transfer them to the company for a small payment. The fraud was open and notorious. Federal land agents reported it repeatedly. Washington did nothing because the congressmen who would have had to act were themselves largely dependent on the timber industry for political support. When the Progressive Era brought reform politics in the early 1900s, the industry pivoted to lobbying. The companies invested in building relationships with the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the congressional committees that oversaw them. They hired former government officials. They made strategic campaign contributions. The results were regulatory frameworks that consistently prioritized timber production and gave companies enormous latitude in how they operated their labor camps. Workers had essentially no recourse within this system. Workers' compensation laws didn't exist in most states until the 1910s and the 1920s, and even after they were enacted, the logging industry successfully lobbied for exemptions and carve-outs that reduced their impact. A man injured in a logging camp before these laws existed had to file a lawsuit against his employer and prove employer negligence, which required hiring a lawyer and gathering evidence in an environment entirely controlled by his opponent. Very few men had the resources to do this, and the companies knew it. Alice Hamilton, the pioneering physician who founded the field of occupational medicine in America, documented working conditions in American industry during the 1910s with a rigor and honesty that made her deeply unpopular with industry. Her reports described the systematic underreporting of occupational deaths and diseases and the mechanisms companies used to suppress information about workplace hazards. She described the company doctor system plainly. It was not a medical system designed to serve workers. It was a liability management system designed to serve companies. Camp 5 in Michigan's Ontonagon County was held up by industry publications as a model operation, a place where a man could earn good wages in healthy conditions. Promotional lithographs showed well-fed men sitting down to enormous meals in clean dining halls. The images circulated widely. They did their job. What they didn't show was that Camp 5 had a death rate during its peak years roughly equivalent to working in an underground coal mine. State labor investigators examined the camp's internal records in 1,894 and found a pattern of injuries that the foreman had been systematically underreporting for at least 3 years. The report was filed. The company disputed its findings. Nothing changed. Camp 5 continued operating for another 6 years, and its reputation as a model camp continued to be cited in industry literature throughout that period. The Weyerhaeuser camps in Washington and Idaho were, by the standards of the industry, not the worst places a man could work. But not the worst is a long way from the image the company cultivated. IWWW, organizing reports from the period, documented bunkhouses that were routinely overcrowded, a company hospital system that prioritized limiting liability over providing care, and a disciplinary culture in which any man who raised safety concerns was watched, then harassed, then fired if he persisted. The company's public communications were a masterclass in shaping perception. Company newsletters emphasized productivity records and wages paid to skilled workers. They were silent on occupational injury rates, on the conditions in remote spike camps where the most dangerous work was done, and on the fate of men who were quietly dismissed after raising concerns the company didn't want on record. The Crossett Lumber Company in Arkansas built a company town in 1899 that publicized itself extensively as proof that responsible corporate management could provide workers with everything they needed without the interference of unions or government. What the company's publications did not address was the two-tier labor system throughout the operation. White workers received wages and decent housing. Black workers, who performed some of the most dangerous work, received lower wages and clearly inferior facilities, entirely legal under Arkansas law at the time, and entirely invisible in the company's self-promotional materials. What all of these famous camps share is the gap between their public face and their operating reality. The public face was crafted carefully and distributed deliberately through company publications, cooperative local newspapers that depended on company advertising, and industry associations that lobbied Congress and produced favorable testimony for regulatory hearings. The operating reality was documented in pieces, in union reports and government investigations, and the occasional lawsuit, but never assembled into a coherent picture. The public could easily see the companies that ran these camps understood that their reputations were assets, and they managed those assets with the same care they brought to managing their timber inventory. The difference is that the timber inventory eventually ran out, and the reputations they had built survived long enough to become part of the official history of the industry. The camps got the legacy they had paid for. The men who died in them got unmarked ground. The era of the Great American Logging Camps ended between the 1930s and the 1950s, for reasons that had less to do with moral awakening than the straightforward fact that the forests had been cut down. The white pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin that had seemed inexhaustible in 1860 were largely gone by 1920. The cutover lands stretched across the northern Great Lakes region in a landscape of stumps and brush that would take decades to begin recovering. The Pacific Northwest timber industry survived longer, sustained by forests that were larger, but it too eventually faced the limits of what could be extracted without any effort at replenishment. The environmental consequences of the logging era are impossible to fully separate from the human ones, because both flowed from the same set of corporate decisions. A company that viewed forests as a resource to be consumed rather than managed, and that viewed workers as a resource to be consumed rather than protected, was operating from a single underlying philosophy. Depletion was the inevitable outcome in both cases. The New Deal era brought the first meaningful federal labor protections to American workers. The Wagner Act of 1935 protected workers' right to organize and collectively bargain, though it came decades too late for the men who had already died. The towns that logging companies had built and then abandoned when the timber was exhausted became a particular kind of American ruin. Dozens of communities across the upper Midwest that had been company towns in their prime found themselves stranded when the companies moved on. The stores closed, the mills went silent. The housing stock, which had never been built to last because permanence hadn't been part of the plan, began to deteriorate. Some of these towns disappeared entirely. Others survived in diminished form, sustained by farming or small-scale manufacturing, or simply by the stubbornness of the people who had built their lives there and didn't want to leave. The men who died in the camps left almost no traces in the historical record. The unmarked graves that exist in remote forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Washington, Oregon, and across the South hold men whose names are gone. There are no official death records for most of them. The company records that might have contained their names have largely been destroyed or lost. What we know about the human cost of the logging era comes primarily from fragments that survived, occasional lawsuits that produced public documentation, the writings of journalists and reformers who paid attention, and the records that the IWW kept because they understood that documenting the deaths was itself a form of resistance. Historians who have examined what records do exist estimate that occupational death rates in American logging were 2 to 3 times higher than in coal mining, which was itself considered an extraordinarily dangerous industry. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which began collecting occupational mortality data in the early 1900s, consistently showed logging at or near the top of its most dangerous industries list. But these figures captured only the deaths that were reported, a significant undercount of the actual toll. There is no national memorial to the men who died in America's logging camps. There is no official acknowledgement from the federal government of the convict leasing system that sent thousands of black men to their deaths in southern timber operations. The companies that built their fortunes on this labor are mostly gone, absorbed by mergers or dissolved by bankruptcy, or simply wound down when the timber ran out, and their successors are under no obligation to address what their predecessors did. What remains is the land itself, slowly recovering in many places, permanently altered in others. And the fragments of the historical record that researchers and historians have assembled over the past several decades, which make clear that the story of American logging is not simply a story of industrial triumph or even of industrial excess. It is a story of systematic abuse, of deliberate suppression of information, of the corruption of public institutions by private wealth, and of thousands of men who died without anyone in power caring enough to count them accurately. The forests grew back, slowly and imperfectly, in many of the places where they had been stripped away. The record of what happened in those forests has been slower to return to the light. But it is there, in the archives, in the few surviving company records, in the union documents, in the reports of the journalists and reformers who fought to expose it a century ago. It is there for anyone willing to look, and now you have. If this history is new to you, there is a lot more where it came from. The story of how American industries shaped, exploited, and occasionally transformed this country is one of the richest and most overlooked areas of our national history. Subscribe to stay with us as we keep digging into it. And if this documentary gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. The conversations that happen in this community are genuinely some of the best discussions about history on this platform. Thank you for watching.